Well, first of all, let me just introduce myself because I don't introduce myself very often on this podcast. So,
No worries.
Hamataki Api Nape Choose Api Chante Washte. I just greet all of you, with a traditional Lakota greeting. And actually, when we say Hamataki Api, it just means hello, relatives. And I think that actually speaks to the book itself and the topic at hand, but also it speaks to I guess my personal relationship or my familiar relationship to the Deloria family. They are a proximity. Their family is a proximity to ours in many ways, which I'll talk a little bit about. Given Vine Deloria's biography, he was born in 1933 in Standing Rock, and he was enrolled in Standing Rock as well. But his family is actually Ihankdawa, which is Yankton. And there's a really good book that he has called Singing for His Spirit, where he talks about kind of his family legacy. And suffice it to say, he was actually born and raised in an Episcopalian family. And in fact, his father, Vine Deloria, actually knew my grandfather, Andrew Estes, and they were actually both. My my grandfather wasn't a clergy necessarily, but he definitely was a lay reader, and he was in the Episcopalian Church. He was also a first language Lakota speaker, and he also knew a lot about Lakota spirituality, and in fact, was known to assist in UEPs and other kind of ceremonies, while also being kind of active in the church itself. And so, I kind of think that a lot of Vine Deloria's personal background actually is very similar to mine. He grew up, following his father around to these different convocations. He lived very much a political life. He talks a little bit about it in this book a bit, but I think you have to like remember that back in the day when he was kind of growing up in the 40s and the 50s, when he was traveling around with his father was going to these various reservations, and it was not a very kind of it was very hostile to political organizing. And so one of the ways that Lakota Dakota people of the Ochete Shawkoni organized is through the church, because it was one of the only sanctioned ways. And the Episcopal Church was only the one of the few sects of Christianity that allowed its practitioners, especially indigenous people, to speak their language. And so they would communicate at these convocations in Lakota, in the presence of their white Indian agents, other kind of white missionaries, but they were actually organizing against termination legislation. So they're using the auspices of the church itself to actually organize politically. And so that was kind of there's kind of a cool factoid. And so I imagine, Vine Deloria Jr. following around his father, Vine Deloria, kind of, sitting at his knee, so to speak, listening to all these kind of different political leaders around our reservations, and kind of growing up with that in mind, but also being heavily influenced by Christianity in this time period. Not to say that he didn't have like a Lakota identity or Dakota identity, which he very much did, but nonetheless, I think that Christian influence really comes to the fore in this book. And in fact, he went to seminary school after the Marines, and I think he was on his way to become, a leader in the Episcopalian Church. And then, of course, the Red Power movement happened. He became an activist, so to speak, the becoming the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, sort of in the fight against termination, but also at this kind of new era, this new consciousness in 1964 around what became coined as the Red Power movement in 1966 by Clyde Warrior, in conversation with Stokely Carmichael. And so, thus begins his kind of political career. And then in 1969, he publishes a very famous text called Custer Died for Your Sins, which we've done an entire podcast on with Vine Deloria's son, Phil Deloria. So you can go check that out. It's the hashtag Native Reads podcast. But his son talks about that book and its kind of its relevance today. And I feel like if you go back and read that book, it speaks to the contemporary moment, much in the same way that going back and reading this book, which I hadn't read since like 15 years ago. But it's a lot of the things that he's talking about in this book like speak to this particular moment in time. But before we get into that, I just want to say that Vine Deloria Jr. He's published widely. He's kind of considered the preeminent indigenous studies professor, intellectual of the Red Power movement and beyond. Somebody once, I've heard this multiple times, but people are like, who's going to be the next Vine Deloria Jr. of this generation? I don't know who that's going to be. I don't think there is another Vine Deloria Jr. I think there can be many Vine Deloria Juniors, or actually people just creating, new kind of new work based on his work. But I would say, nonetheless, he like kind of kicked in the doors of the academy, and he's not necessarily a traditional academic, as you would tell by his writing style. It's not very academic. He's very we were joking earlier before we hit record about some of the jokes that he makes. It's the sort of the warm Indian humor very much comes is very evident on the page as you're reading this. And it's a page turner. It's an easy read, very different than what we would consider like modern academic text today. But I do want to say that, Vine Deloria Jr. did pass away in 2005, having published, dozens of books, most of which were seminal, works. And he himself has, founded sort of like a school of thought that I don't think, really is taken seriously. I think he was probably one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. And for reasons we'll get into in this text. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that before I get into the kind of the historical context.
I think it's super interesting that he has this in some ways syncretist or hybrid living experience as an indigenous person, because it's very relevant for a lot of indigenous peoples. I think actually in like not just across like North America, but in Latin America, since my context is primarily the Andes. Peru, I'm Bolivian, but like Peru and Ecuador are very close countries culturally and geographically. There is the influence of Catholicism and the syncretism that exists um, with between like Catholicism and the many indigenous deities and um sites of worship that were like introduced or taken in by Catholicism by force or otherwise. And even my own experience, surprisingly enough, for I always tell this to my friends as like or at parties as like a shocker, but I grew up Mormon, surprisingly enough. So so there's always that interesting understanding of when my grandma who converted, she had her own experience of um she was the one who converted my family, and she would also talk about how Jesus came from after he was crucified, came to the Americas and taught indigenous peoples like civilized ways, which was a very interesting way of thinking about how my own culture, like my own indigenous like re-indigenization process of like trying to relearn my culture of that's such an interesting way to in some ways both take pride but also be colonized, because the point like oftentimes is that Jesus like the priests were the first ones to encounter Christianity, whereas in my grandmother in like Mormon theology and in her own like reworkings of it too, it was Jesus himself who brought indigenous cultures. They just degraded over time. So I think that type of like hybrid indigenous um Christian outlook is very important to note, but it's also very relevant. Not just it's very relevant for a lot of people these days, and it creates very weird understandings of identity. But I think Vine Deloria Jr. does a good job at like show making the critiques of Christianity in many of its values and why like they inevitably have led to the settler colonial conditions structures that we have now.
Yeah, and for my personal background, actually, I was born and raised. I was baptized Catholic, born and raised Episcopalian, and in fact, I learned most of the language, the Lakota language that I know today, through the church itself. And I was told by my uncle the reason why we became Episcopalians is because it was one of the few, it was one of the only religions that would, Christian religions, denominations that would allow us to pray in our language. And so he was like, I'd rather, you know I guess he said that my grandfather said that he would rather pray to his God in his language,
Mhm.
than to pray in English. And then there was this other argument in our family that was like, well, now that we don't have to be underground anymore, we don't need the church anymore. And so there's kind of an abandonment. Some of my family still goes to the church, but others, have kind of like abandoned the church, myself included. I don't consider myself a Christian anymore.
Me either.
Um, but